This show is supported by State Farm. You have insurance for your home, your health, and your car. Why don't you have insurance for your small business? So many small business owners think they don't need or don't even know about small business insurance. Protecting a source of revenue is one thing, but so is protecting all of your hard work and your team members. State Farm agents are all small business owners too, so they know how to help small business owners choose personalized policies that fit their budgets. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Talk to your local agent today.
Hey there! Did you know Kroger always gives you savings and rewards on top of our lower-than-low prices? And when you download the Kroger app, you'll enjoy over $500 in savings every week with digital coupons. And don't forget fuel points to help you save up to $1 per gallon at the pump. Want to save even more? With a Boost membership, you'll get double fuel points and free delivery. So shop and save big at Kroger today. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Savings may vary by state. Restrictions apply. See site for details.
Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 464, part 1, interview with Jason Bell about his book, Cracking the Nazi Code. Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of New Brunswick, Mr. Bell explores Germany after the Great War. The political left and right are vying for power, as the center is simply trying to hold. But the German right is organized, and it is patient. They know what they want, but need the next generation of men to come of age before the next war can start. And they have a list of everyone to be removed, namely every non-Aryan on the planet. Mr. Bell, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, Ray.
Absolutely. I loved your book. I just wanted to tell everybody off the bat, because obviously I have a lot of World War II enthusiasts who listen to this. If you think you know World War II, there's the whole pre-World War II, in between World War I and World War II, and that's kind of a lot of the meat of your book. And I learned so much, and it gave me a new appreciation to know that there was something before the Nazis. You know, they had to build on something. So we'll get into that. The point I wanted to make is, for all you listeners out there, there's a lot of stuff that I didn't know, and I've been doing this since age 12, so there's a good chance you don't know it either. So, Mr. Bell, let's jump into this. So I'm sure this has been brought up before. This is nothing new, but the timeliness, the appropriateness of your book in today's news cycles could not be more on the nose, which just goes to show that even though that particular evil was buried, that doesn't mean it has to stay underground. Perhaps the term dog whistle wasn't being used in the 1920s, but the idea of getting one's, how should I say, less than moral message out there without being too obvious is certainly not a new concept.
That's exactly right. So there's this question of how you can organize these racist attacks in a way that will get together the core group of people who could commit the attacks while preventing the kind of opposition that would be able to break the conspiracy from happening.
Right. Yeah. So because you can't just come right out and say it. I mean, especially if you're literally a minority party or you're not that powerful yet, you have to finagle, you have to lie, you have to mislead the people that you want to support you financially and at the voting booth. And that's certainly not a common thing. And the pre-Nazi party, the German right, if you will, was very good at that. And we'll jump into that in just a moment. So let me ask, how did this book come about? And how did you learn of the other Mr. Bell?
Sure. So I was actually looking for something else entirely. So I was looking for... I was looking for a philosophy connection. So I had I've been interested in relations between American pragmatism and German phenomenology. They sounded a lot alike to me. Right. And so I went on a kind of a fact-finding mission to Germany, where some of the original pragmatists had studied and where phenomenology was founded. And that's where I found a dissertation written by one Winthrop Bell, completed in 1914, that explained the pragmatists to the phenomenologists. So that was the missing link. But the dissertation was missing 2 pages. And I found that Winthrop Bell's papers were housed at Mount Allison University in eastern Canada, in New Brunswick, but they were being held under restriction. At that time, I had no idea why they were being housed under restriction. So I wrote a letter to the university's president asking for permission to come in. A couple of weeks later, I got a letter back from him granting permission to go in. I subsequently learned that was after the university had checked with Britain's Foreign Office to confirm that this was permissible.
Wow.
But again, at that moment, I had no idea why these papers were under restriction. Papers can be under restriction for all kinds of, family, personal, business reasons.
Oh, right.
And so I noticed pretty quickly, this would have been 2008, 2009, that Winthrop Bell had done intelligence work for the British government, and he'd met with people like the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, David Lloyd George. But at that moment, it just kind of seemed like an interesting historical footnote to me.
Right.
It was nice that here is this philosopher who was also a spy. It was a few years later that I seriously began reading these intelligence reports and realized that he was the first to warn against, to warn about the Nazi conspiracy. So he was a warning of their creation in 1919. Then in 1939, he was the first to warn against Hitler's plans for the Holocaust. And so that at that point, I really had to just switch my topic, so to speak. So I went from explicating his philosophical works to explicating his historical importance as an intelligence agent.
Wow. The British are known for staying tight-lipped for decades, lifetimes after, things like that. So that makes sense. Now, what you just said might surprise some percentage of our listeners. They didn't know about Hitler yet, as far as the final solution, all that stuff. But when I got to your book, where it's like, no, it's not just the Jews, even though that's a target that will, bring a lot of people in. They had an idea of what to do with all non-Aryans, and I think that was maybe the big bombshell that I got out of your book. I mean, that's just insane. I want to get rid of everybody who doesn't think like me.
That's right. So there was a bizarre idea, and it really came from a perverted reading of Darwin. So Darwin's Darwinian ideas of the survival of the fittest. And so these, half-educated people in the early 20th century, and it wasn't just the Nazis. There was also Talat Pasha in the Ottoman Empire, conceived the notion that it worked the same way with human races, and that eventually one race was going to conquer and destroy the rest. So the paranoid thought became, it will either be us or them. Right. Either we're going to get genocided or they're going to do it. And so Hitler wasn't the first to propose this. In fact, it was being done by Talat Pasha in the Ottoman Empire during World War I, when he was wiping out the Armenians and the Greeks and the Jews with the idea of creating a racially pure homeland.
Right.
German military intelligence was there supporting this. Some people were horrified in Germany. Other people supported it. The people who supported it during the war began advocating the idea that what was being done in the Ottoman Empire was the right way to fight a war. In other words, to actually win a war, you would need to utterly annihilate foreign populations. And so that became Hitler's notion that there was the Aryans would be destroyed if he didn't destroy them first. And so Winthrop Bell described the implication of this was that all non-Aryans were going to have to be destroyed, meaning all the blacks, all the Asians, all the Slavic people, the indigenous people of North America, all the indigenous people on Earth were eventually going to have to be slaughtered. The attack on the Jews was not going to end with the Jews.
Right. And that's the part that really got my attention. That sounds a lot like game theory. Even if there's a 1% chance we could lose, we need to totally wipe out our adversaries. I mean, that's obviously very extremist thinking. And when most of us would hear that, we'd go, well, that's insane. But obviously there's something about Hitler's makeup, the experiences he had as a younger person, whatever. He went, actually, I think that's the way to go. So we're going to get into that. So let's jump into this. Could you give us a little bit more information about Winthrop Bell and maybe tell us about his time in Germany before the outbreak of the Great War, and then also his incredible 4 years during World War I?
Sure. So he had shown up in Germany in 1910 to study philosophy, and this was at a moment of crisis when World War I nearly could have begun. So there was an effort of Germany to expand into Morocco. The French and the British signaled that they were going to fight. There was a kind of a territorial trade that was made in order to prevent war from happening. But at that point, Germany and Britain both began efforts to rearm and to beef up their intelligence services. At first, I was suspicious that maybe Bell had been sent into Germany as a spy as part of this. And later in 1914, when war broke out, the Germans thought the same thing, that Bell had been sent as a spy. But in fact, it was totally innocent. He just loved philosophy. He had some family money. He went to study phenomenology with a great leader of the movement named Edmund Husserl. And so he was there just by complete and total coincidence. Studied throughout, moved to Göttingen, where Husserl was located in 1911, was working assiduously on his dissertation, had nearly finished when war broke out in a more limited way between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Serbians. Right. He had some friends who had diplomatic connections who said, "Don't worry, this is not going to end up a big thing. Calmer heads are going to prevail after the Serbians get a bloody nose." Yeah. And so he decided he would rush through the last revisions of his dissertation and then graduate, then get out of the country. And of course, there were all kinds of secret alliances and networks that were in place. And so Britain found itself in the war. Bell did not have a chance to get out of the country. He was a Canadian, but at the time, all Canadians were British subjects. Right. So the day, the morning that Britain declared war, several hours later, he was arrested and then spent a few months in custody in various places in Göttingen, where he was a student. He was suspected of being a spy. The Germans had begun a kind of a starvation torture program against him to try to get him to confess, but he had nothing to confess. Sure. He had some powerful friends who intervened. And finally, he was sent to the British civilian prisoner of war camp, which had been set up at Ruhleben, which was a former horse racing track near Berlin, where all the British prisoners went to, including some aristocrats, wealthy business people, and common laborers. For a few months, people were deeply despondent there, terrible depression. Then when people realized the war was going to be a long one, they decided to set up Ruhleben as a kind of outpost of Britain. It became a little Britain. Right. Rich prisoners began to hire the poorer prisoners, and these were people who had skills in carpentry and mechanics, to basically build up a culture there, to build up facilities, a YMCA, a theater. And they had first-rate talent there, so there were traveling British musicians and athletes. Wow. And so they were able to set up musical theater, full performances and costumes. They had a rigorous athletic schedule with these professional athletes competing alongside serious amateurs. And so it was, kind of fun for being a prisoner. Were ultimately, miserable by, about their loss of freedom. But they had, fun within the bounds of what they were able to accomplish. They were able to, bribe the guards to get in illegal goods, including alcohol and things like this. And sometimes that got a little bit too serious, and the prisoners would be brawling with each other, or sometimes near riots would break out. Right. But all in all, it worked out fairly well. And one of the other notable attractions of the place was there was a university that was set up, and Winthrop Bell taught there. He taught engineering and philosophy and history, among other disciplines. And that was the kind of golden moment for being a Renaissance man, because there were so few professors. These professors ended up doing a lot of things, but it was a rigorous curriculum. Ultimately, credits there were recognized by leading British institutions. And a lot of these, common common workers, carpenters, et cetera, were able to get a university education and were able to get good paying jobs in Britain after the end of the war.
Wow. Can I just say real quick how inspiring that part of the book was? It's like, here's someone who's in a horrific situation. They have no chance. They have to be there. They have no choice. They have to be there. But the idea of making the best of a bad situation, that doesn't mean we can't come together. That doesn't mean we can't celebrate the good things of life. And at the very, very least, keeping busy in a situation like that, it was probably the best thing for them.
Absolutely. And I think you see the two tracks. So the prisoners who really threw themselves into the cultural life were still, depressed to be there,
Sure.
once in a while. But the ones who, fell into things like, drinking and, that's kind of all they did. They would end up in these, deep depressions that didn't lift.
Right.
So one of Bell's friends there said, yeah, everybody here is depressed some of the time, but there's some people who are depressed all the time. And it's the ones who kept themselves busy, who are the ones who kept their depression to an absolute minimum.
Right. My father was in the military for a couple of decades, and one of his sayings was, when in doubt, stay busy, something will turn up. And that made me think of Bell and the others. So what happens to his education? I mean, he's in Germany, and now they're at war with other countries in the Western Hemisphere. I imagine that. Is he freaking out? Is he worried, or what happens to his almost finishing university just as the war breaks out?
Well, so he. It was a strange position. So he had defended his dissertation. His committee had passed him with honors, but
Right.
the university itself voted to annul his doctorate. So he was kind of functionally, but not formally, a PhD.
Right.
He was planning during his time in prison to become a professor at Harvard. So he had good connections there. The university at Harvard had actually tried to spring him from prison in coordination with the U.S. State Department, so he could be a professor there.
Mm-hmm.
But for the Germans, that was a non-starter. The Germans were worried that any of these men who were let out could become soldiers. So he kept up his reading in philosophy. His German friends who were philosophers would send him articles, so he was able to keep up with the state of the art. And all indications were that that's what he was planning on doing once the war finished, that he was going to get out. He would travel back to Canada to see his family and then head down to Cambridge in Massachusetts to take up a teaching position at Harvard.
Yeah, he's got a plan. So before we move on to the post-World War I world, I just have to say, I know you in the book you kind of have to get through World War I, but at the same time you want to explain it to give everything else in the book context. And can I just say, you did a masterful job. I'm like, you bring things together. Obviously, you have to condense it, but it really made sense about from the German perspective, what they were going through. Hoping or praying for an early victory or quick victory. That doesn't happen. Now, what do you do? I really enjoyed that part of the book. It made me understand that era a lot better. So World War I is over with. MI6, which we've all heard of thanks to James Bond movies, is financially tapped, because they spent all their money, whatever, during the war. But Bell and some other prisoners are going to be taken to the UK at the very least to be interviewed because those who are in charge of the British government need to know what's going on in Germany on the ground. Obviously, they don't because there's been a war, but Winthrop Bell and others have been there. Maybe they can provide some information.
That's right. And so of all the British people or British subjects in Germany, Winthrop Bell at that moment was the very best informed. And this was sort of a trick of his having been in Göttingen. So that at the time was Germany's leading math and physics university. Right. Winthrop had an undergraduate degree in mathematics. And so when he was at Göttingen, he wasn't just associating with philosophers. In fact, most of his friends were mathematicians and physicists. Those were the people who were recruited into German military intelligence during World War I. Right. So he had close friends who had these central positions of authority. When he got out of prison, he had a couple of weeks in Berlin while the revolution was being fought on the streets. He would meet with these people in cafes, and he had this fantastic inner portrait of what Germany looked like. So what these extremist factions looked like, the democracy that had the support of the people, that had firm control of the institutions for the moment. But also the background was absolute desperation. So food was not getting into Germany. The people had been starved throughout the war. People kept on dying after the war because the British food blockade stayed in place. And so all of this resulted in a very dangerous environment. And yet it was hopeful. So democracy was still in charge.
Right.
But these extremists were waiting in the wings. And so Bell was able to tell. So first, it would have been people in military intelligence. So at that moment, MI6 was a civilian agency. First, Bell was talking to intelligence officers in the military branch, but they were impressed by what he had to say because they simply didn't know what was going on in Germany.
Yeah.
What they were learning was really from propaganda that was being churned out of Germany, which made it look to Britain like the communists were about to take over the country. They had a well-formed propaganda machine. Bell said that was an illusion. In fact, the communists in Germany were weak at that moment. Democracy was firmly in charge, but they were not broadcasting their message because they were so busy just trying to figure out how to run the country that they were silent.
Right. Yeah. So he gets over there. He's articulate. He's intelligent. He, like you said, a Renaissance man. He knows a little bit about a lot of things, and I'm sure his answers more than gave them what they are looking for. But so obviously he's an asset. And just real quick before we go on, I have always loved how fate, the universe, serendipity, what have you, puts people in the right place at the right time, changing the trajectory of their life. And I just picture, I'm going to get my PhD, I'm going to go teach at Harvard, just have a nice, normal, comfortable life. And then all this happens. I just enjoy moments like that. And obviously he's going to do great service for the Allies. So how does his answering these questions and they realize what they've got, how does that affect his immediate future?
Sure. Well, so he met with the Canadian Prime Minister, Robert Borden, who asked him to hold off on going back to North America. So Borden was going to work on getting Bell an intelligence position once he heard all the stuff that Bell knew, which was far superior to what even prime ministers knew. And so Borden began working the phone lines. At the same time, Bell had British military intelligence on board, so there were two kind of sides working for him.
Right.
But still, he finally gets word that he's going to be offered a job as a desk analyst. And Bell at that point said, if that's what you're going to offer me, then forget about it. I'm going to go to Harvard and I'm going to teach.
Yeah.
He was willing to take a job in intelligence if he could go into Germany operating undercover in this very dangerous situation, because that's where he thought he could be effective. As a desk analyst back in London, he did not think he could be effective.
Sure. Yeah, because people like him are going to be like, look, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it right. I'm going to do it, to be as efficient and as effective as I can, which means going back to Germany. And he does speak the language. He does write, because I remember you saying he was writing something in German to keep up with his skill. So I guess he goes back to Germany. What is he seeing there that kind of alarms him as far as the true cause of the German right? And here in the book, you really break it down, the German left, the German right. Like you said, the people who are actually running the country are kind of new at this because they're just used to taking orders from the Prussians or whoever. And now they're trying to figure how to run a country out. That makes them vulnerable, and everybody's kind of vying for positions for the future.
That's right. So this extremist, right-wing organization, it had become a right-wing organization after World War I. During World War I, what Bell said is functionally it ran Germany. So it was the country. The Emperor of Germany was kind of a clueless playboy. Right. The real dictator of the country was Erich Ludendorff, who hated the Jews and the Slavs. And he was the dictator of the country. He'd created all kinds of organizations who were loyal to him personally and not to the country. So after the war, Ludendorff flees to neutral nations along with a lot of these other conspirators. And so Bell recognized that they had a lot of clout in one way. They had a lot of money behind them, but they were utterly discredited in terms of popularity. So the German people did not trust them. And that was because this propaganda that these military officers were leading during World War I had Germany convinced that they were just about to win the war right up until the day of the collapse. So this came as a complete shock to the German public. And after the war, despite these propaganda efforts to rehabilitate Ludendorff, nobody was buying it. So he was describing this, and this was in his late fall reports of 1918 to British intelligence, that this group didn't have they were real and they were active. It was a real conspiracy, but they didn't have any immediate chances of success. Any success was going to be a long-term endeavor. Right. Meanwhile, it was a similar situation with the extreme left. They had a lot of weaponry. They had funding coming in from Russia. And yet they had very little popular support outside of the extremist trade unions. The military hated them. Politicians hated them. And so for a while, at least, right up and through March 1919, Bell saw that democracy had the upper hand. It was in April 1919 that he began warning that situation had become so disordered that soon enough, one of these extremist groups was going to take over the country. And by April 1919, it would be decided whether it would be the extremist left wing or the extremist right wing.
Well, that's incredible because we're getting to the meat of the book now. Here's Ludendorff, who has extreme views. He has power during the war. There are others with him. There are others who support him. But the message is so extreme that they lose popularity, and it obviously did not help that they lost the war. And so this might be a valuable lesson for someone else who picks up the mantle after him to go, have your ideas, have your agenda, but that doesn't mean you have to blare it out to the world. That doesn't mean you have to show your sword. Just carry your sword, if I can use that analogy. So during all this, so Bell's watching this. He's on the ground. He's there. And he's sending reports back. Now, during all of this, we are building up, of course, to the Versailles, discussions, the treaty that's coming up. U.S. President Wilson's got one idea. The French and the British, who obviously are very upset that, millions of their men are dead, probably have a different idea. But the information coming from Bell does affect Lloyd George to a degree as they're getting ready for this very important series of meetings.
That's right. So Lloyd George had run on a re-election campaign of making the Germans pay.
Right.
There was this idea that Germany had a lot of money and that they could pay. And Bell, first having met with MI6 and with Sir Mansfield Smith Cumming, who was the director of MI6, was able to convince MI6 first that this was utterly delusional, that Germany had any money to pay. Sure. And that by trying to force democracy to pay, that was what was going to rehabilitate this extreme right-wing movement. Mm-hmm. So they flew Winthrop Bell into Paris to brief David Lloyd George during this period when the draft of the treaty was still coming together. And David Lloyd George immediately changed his tune. So there were much harsher plans being constructed. So we now think of Versailles as being incredibly harsh. When the initial draft form, it was going to be far worse.
Wow.
And Bell said that if it went through in its initial draft form, war would break out immediately. So the flashpoint was going to be in Poland. German troops were assembled at the border because the draft Treaty of Versailles was going to hand over Germany's richest land in the east to Poland. Bell said, if that happens, there's going to be an invasion of Poland, and we're not in a position to stop that from happening. So it'll mean most likely the end of Poland. David Lloyd George was worried and frightened about this and decided to reverse course on this. So instead of simply handing over the territory from Germany to Poland, instead it would be a vote of the local peoples to decide which way they wanted to go. So David Lloyd George adopted that along with some of Bell's other positions. Unfortunately, at that moment, Wilson, who had all along been favoring friendlier terms to Germany, underwent a serious health crisis. A lot of scholars nowadays think that he had an undiagnosed stroke, and Wilson just lost the thread. So he was no longer able to defend the position. So just as David Lloyd George and the British were coming around to the American position, the Americans stopped defending their own position, which sides to the French with the idea of harsh reparations. So it was one of these medical calamities that really changed history, to an unfortunate degree.
Right. Because when you were talking about Germany just a second ago, several phrases leaped into my mind. Even a quartered rat will fight. Not that I'm calling Germany a rat. A drowning man will even grab at the tip of a sword. So if you make them desperate enough, they will see it as they truly have nothing to lose and they can start up again. Yes, it would be ugly and they probably couldn't go on for years. But like you said, the Allies don't have really the means either because they have been bled white just as well. So the last thing we need is another, whatever war here. So going back to Bell, his official cover is as a Reuters reporter, and he's making these discoveries, and he wants to get more information out. And I might be getting this mixed up with a different timeline of the book. Is he having trouble getting his message out about the potential German right that's going on, what he sees, the things that's probably keeping him up at night? He wants to get this information out.
Well, he had to be very cautious. So so at the moment, there was no British intelligence network in Germany other than himself.
Wow.
And so he was having to get his messages back to MI6 through the public telegraph. And so his Reuters cover, what wasn't, just a cover. It was really a constant reminder of, he had to say things that were appropriate for journalists to say. Now, there were ways that he could code his messages that would mean, well, I need to meet somebody in person. Mm-hmm. And eventually, MI6 did have couriers there who could meet him in Berlin and then get the message back to Paris where the encrypted communication could come out. But yeah, he had to be very careful for a long time until eventually the British military intelligence were able to set up shop in Berlin. And then he was able to be more frank in his messages. So really, the change that you see is early in the year, he refers to sources of intelligence, but without attaching names to it, because that would have been far too dangerous. Later in the year, he begins to be able to attach names to specific pieces of information once it can be encrypted. Gotcha.
So earlier, a couple of minutes ago, you said that the German right knows they can't win right now for a lot of different reasons. They're not ready to go back into war or to take over the country because you got the communists, you got the Democrats trying to run the country. But the German right certainly has learned a valuable lesson. They're going to use propaganda. They know they can't win now, so they have to be patient. And they're going to do something that Mussolini did in the 1920s. They're like, hey, let me tell you something you want to hear. We are going to fight the communists. Now, who wouldn't want that? Because obviously when Russia fell in 1917, that scared all of the other countries. And so the German right has learned how to use propaganda, and you tell your potential enemies what they want to hear. They might not support you, but at the very least, they won't fight you.
That's exactly right, and so this is what they were doing in 1919. They were approaching the British and basically confessing that of course we're breaking the terms of the Versailles Agreement. We have all these illegal men under arms, but don't worry, it's because we're taking care of this communist problem for you. And so Bell at the same time was pointing out that was a lie, and that by the spring of 1919, the communists and the German racist extremists had made peace with one another. They were pretending to fight in Eastern Europe, but he said they've stopped fighting one another. Instead, they've turned to targeting the local populations. And in a way, this wasn't a big surprise because Lenin had been set up in Russia by General Ludendorff. Ludendorff had sent Lenin to St. Petersburg with tens of millions of marks in German financing to get rid of the Russian government, to knock Russia out of the war. Then when the negotiations came between Russia and Germany to end the war, Lenin gave Germany absolutely everything it wanted. They were his sponsor. Trotsky, the military strategist for the Soviets, was horrified and appalled that this happened. He did not know that Lenin was operating in close cahoots with the German high command.
Right.
And then through the 1920s, that's where the Germans were able to reconstitute their military, was in the Soviet Union. So Bell was able to describe this, he was able to describe it to MI6, and that was able to take the wind out of the sails of some of the people in British military intelligence who were being approached by this Ludendorff conspiracy and wanted to support it, getting British funding to this group to ostensibly fight the communists. Bell's reports were able to take wind out of the sails, and they refused to communicate with this Ludendorff group in this effort that was planned for 1919 to overthrow the democratic government and ostensibly to destroy communism.
Right. I got to be honest with you. When I got to that part of the book, that gave me chills, because most bad guys, if I can be very generic for a second, are deranged and they're impulsive and they want it now. And that just made me realize that one of the greatest dangers is an enemy who is patient, who is analytical, who puts the little pieces together in a very calm way, knowing that they're building something much larger. And that's what a lot of these groups are doing. They're like, telling the British, the Americans, the French what they want to hear. At the same time, they've got their own plans as far as what to do to the Jews and the Slavs. And that was just that had a very chilling effect on me. But at the same time, and I don't want to press this too hard, but there certainly were anti-Semitic elements in Britain, in America, in France. So when the German right says this, it's not like their messages or their whatever is falling on deaf ears. People are like, that we're okay with that. You do what you got to do. And that was also chilling as well.
That's exactly right. And Bell was aware of this, that there was racism in Britain, and a couple times in his reports, he's comparing and contrasting these, and he's saying, what you're finding in Germany is far more virulent than what you're finding in Britain. So in other words,
right.
what you're getting in Britain tends to be a kind of cultural sense of superiority to Judaism. And kind of if one dare might say it, kind of a modest racism.
Right.
But there was not talk about extermination of racial poison. These were people who had been who were convinced that the long game of history in these Darwinian terms was eventual racial extermination, us versus them. Mm-hmm. And so the plotting was cold-hearted, and these were people who excelled in logistics and strategy and tactics. And they knew exactly what the timeline was going to be in order to be able to reconstitute the German military and to fight again. And they understood the morale of the German people. And this was Clausewitz's old lesson that war is not just a matter of battlefield strategy; it's also of morale. And these leaders of the racist faction knew that the German fighting age population simply was not going to tolerate another war, and that they were going to need to propagandize the youth. Right. And so Bell's reports already in 1919 were describing this, that all these military organizations had been set up to train children because these were going to be the future stormtroopers. The grown-ups, the adults had no interest in fighting a war, so you needed to start from children, right? And propagandize them from their youth. And Bell said this, World War II, 1919, he warned it was going to take a generation for this new army to be in place and for sufficient weaponry to be able to be in place to fight it.
That's chilling. And I guess as 1918, 1919 gives way to the 1920s, Britain's got to deal with their own issues. France has got to rebuild. The Americans have got to deal with their stuff. And Germany is allowed, this is even despite Bell's warnings, this is allowed to fester. This is allowed to grow. You've got Hitler in 1925 with the Beer Hall Putsch, things like that. And so his warnings are coming true, or they're going to come true. But everybody's got their own stuff. Everybody's kind of dealing with their own issues at the same time. So going back to Bell for a second, he's going to leave MI6 for a while. He spent some time in business. He spent some time in academia, but then he goes back to Germany in 1934. What is he seeing in this new Germany?
Sure. So what he sees is that the country is on getting towards a war footing.
Right.
So this was at a moment that Hitler was pretending that his interests were peaceful, that he wanted to protect the interest of bullied German populations.
Yeah.
But Bell saw that there were military preparations that were underway that were far out of scale to match what Hitler was publicly proclaiming. So he went to Berlin. He had some of his close contacts from World War I were still involved deeply in German military intelligence. These were pro-British sources, which was not at all uncommon, even through World War II. Much of German military intelligence was pro-British, and anti-Nazi. So Bell had these sources who were telling him about the preparations that were happening and about this war footing that Britain was on. That Germany was on, and Bell was able to go back to London and to warn his intelligence handlers who were in positions of high authority within the British intelligence system. About what Hitler's plans were,
right?
And that's kind of really a subtext of history is that Bell's warnings were going to influential people. Winston Churchill in 1919, people like Lord Morris Hankey in 1934. Who were far more nervous about Germany than they otherwise would have been. And Churchill from 1920 is working to ensure that the British military is keeping pace with German rearmament, which at that point was secret.
Right.
But it was, a long story of Britain keeping its eye on this threat. And you can see in history that sometimes it's not simply what the prime minister is doing, but it's also what the shadow government is doing.
Yeah.
And so Britain was, in a position that, when they came together to negotiate with Hitler at Munich in 1938, that, they were able to, be in a position of strength that, basically, as Bell said, if, threatening Hitler, that if he crossed the lines that they had set, there would be war.
Right. Well, see, this is what I find so fascinating and to be honest, frustrating. Here's Bell for years, warning, ringing the warning bell. And of course, by spring of 1939, when Bell's trying to write up a report about the coming danger, let's be honest, it's too late. You can't go into Germany and change things. Whatever's going to happen is going to happen. The best that you can do is be prepared. And so in some ways, I wonder how he truly felt about it. Is anybody listening to me? But once you get to a certain point, you can no longer meddle in directly other countries. And I just found the whole thing, I was just, because we know what's going to happen. It was just so frustrating. And I'm not even sure if he could have imagined what was going to happen once war officially broke out. Do you think he was shocked by the ghastliness, even though he might not have known officially the Holocaust? I'm just picturing him watching the events of World War II unfold, and he's just, it's got to be killing him inside, because he seems like a very genuine, gentle person of ideas.
Yeah, so I think what was deeply shocking to him was not that the war happened, but it was how quickly Europe fell. Right. And I think that's the testament to the kind of warning effect that Bell had in Britain, versus what the Nazis were able to do with their lies and their propaganda in Europe is telling. So in other words, places like France, were not on a war footing. Right. And they believed Hitler's proclamations that he was a peaceful guy, whereas the British didn't. And but I think still, it was a shock to Winthrop just how quickly the Western powers fell, and then of course when Russia entered the war, how quickly the East fell.
Right.
So all of these countries that were pro-democratic, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, suddenly were in the eastern sphere. The western sphere belonged to the Nazis, and so he was for a while depressed at just how quickly things had fallen apart, and
Sure.
yet he volunteered his services to keep up the fight. That is to say, to reconstitute Canada's war machine.
Right. Yeah, no, it's amazing. I can only imagine him reading the newspapers and, knowing what he knows, that all those years ago, the careful planning, the lying, the obfuscation of the German right did pay off for them, and they were able to finally, like you said, years later, execute on their plans. And at first, obviously, they had a lot of success. Mr. Bell, thank you very much for your time today. Thank you very much for this book. And just to share one last thing with you before I go, by the time I finished reading your book, I had a certain mindset. Whenever I'm listening to someone, there was a part of my subconscious almost going, what's behind those words? What are you really saying? It kind of makes you think on a deeper level than I was used to doing. And again, everybody, every government lies, every politician will smile and shake your hands. At the end of the day, it's what someone does or does not do. It's their actions. It's not their words, because those can be ignored very easily. And the German right was able to get away with a lot for a very long time.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and I think this is good old American pragmatism at play. And
right.
It's the pragmatic question is what are people intending to accomplish?
Mm-hmm.
Ideas are part of that, but the proof is in the pudding. What are people doing? And I think that's one of the reasons why American intelligence was it kind of had to get thrown together in World War II, but when it did get thrown together in the OSS. Despite the lack of a deep history, it became effective pretty quickly, because that's the pragmatic question. What are these foreign leaders intending, and what are they doing to prepare for it?
Yeah, because, and I won't give this away, but near the end of the book, Bell is like, yeah, but what are we going to do? He's ready for, it's time, no more words, no more, it's time for action. And of course, by then it's too late, but he certainly did his part. Mr. Bell, thank you for this book. It's called Cracking the Nazi Code, The Untold Story of Agent A12 and the Solving of the Holocaust Code. Thank you very much, and you have a great day, sir.
Thank you very much, Ray. It was great to be on your show, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 464, part 2, All Hell Breaks Loose. Last time, in mid-August, the Romanians, backed by German equipment, kept coming at the defensive perimeter of Odessa, and try as they might, the only result was more Romanian and Soviet dead, but the defenders still held. To wit, the Romanians had decided to come back via the Black Sea, but this attacking formation was spotted by Soviet aerial reconnaissance. Soon those planes were joined by bombers, and together they all dove down on the 8 large and 4 small transport ships, being escorted by 10 patrol boats. If the defenders had tried anything by ship, they would have suffered much loss. But coming as they were from the sky, soon 2 transports were sunk and a 3rd was damaged. As they were the main part of this attack, now weakened, the entire fleet turned for home, minus their lost ships and crew. As things now stood, there was a growing number of corpses on the Black Sea floor and around the outer perimeter of Odessa. As for those bodies submerged, they would be taken care of by time and small creatures. When it came to the bodies around Odessa, with spring coming hard upon, disease was now a concern for the city dwellers. The agreed-upon answer was to ask for a ceasefire and then deal with the bodies. The Romanians, though, said no, so the authorities within Odessa waited until dark and had people go out to spread chloride of lime around. It would have to do. We've seen the intense fighting of August 18th, where the Romanians wanted to prove themselves to their German masters, while the defenders wanted to live and prove themselves to Moscow. Thus far, the defenders were winning, Basically, the Siege of Odessa mirrored the larger fighting to their north. Defensive troops would be surrounded and lost in time, but during their last hours, they made the attackers pay dearly. Not that the fighting had dissipated. And all those attacks, though costly, were seemingly about to pay off. On August 19th, more attacks came at the Shitsli and Kargalik areas. The fighting went on all day, and the defenders were doing well, but losing men all the while. By that evening, the strength of these men was fading. By the morning of the next day, the Kargalik defenses had been pierced near Bilyavka, due west of the city. But then it got worse. The invaders kept going, as simply the 25th Rifle Division was too weak to do anything about it. To be sure, there was the ubiquitous counterattack, but this one failed. It had no more punching power than the defense had the day before. The men of the 25th Rifle were spent. The Bilyavka area was captured. But even worse for the defenders of Odessa, the water pump station within the captured territory was also captured and shut down. Clean, drinkable water from the Dniester River going to Odessa was now a thing of the past. Now, that part of the 25th Rifle Division, stationed nearby, was assisted by a part of the 95th Rifle Division. Their orders were simple. If the enemy should penetrate here, the men of the 25th were to counterattack, which again had not been enough. The Romanians came on, and soon, as they continued driving south, forced the Coastal Army Command to withdraw, thereby avoiding encirclement themselves. Within the next few hours, the Army Command staff and survivors of the 95th Rifle were able to withdraw to their defensive line, but further back. Land to the west and southwest of Odessa had just been lost, but even that wasn't the worst of it. With the men of the western sector pulling back, those in the southern sector now found themselves having to do the same. Otherwise, these men would soon find Romanian troops in between them and Odessa. Soon the men of the western sector were reestablished, but now much closer to the outskirts of Odessa. The next day, August 19th, the men of the 1st Regiment of the Naval Infantry, already having done stellar work, were attacked again, but this time they were the ones needing rescue. Just as the western and southern sectors had been penetrated, the eastern, i.e. northern sector, was hit hard. Soon the Naval Regiment was unable to cope, so the 2nd Regiment of the same unit rushed in to help. But even with the men of the 2nd Regiment, the attackers had a 3-to-1 advantage, and the Romanians counted on this by coming back at the defenders time and again. Confidence is one thing, but desperation is quite another. After 8 hours of fighting, some 200 Romanian soldiers and officers now lied dead, and near them were 2 wrecked Romanian tanks.
This show is supported by State Farm. Insurance is a part of any solid financial plan. Making sure you have the important things in life covered is one of the best ways to give yourself a little breathing room when things go awry. It's important to protect not only your business, but yourself as a business owner and all current and future team members. State Farm agents know what it takes to run and protect a small business because State Farm agents are all small business owners and they live and work in your community. So they're deeply attuned to what's happening with other small businesses in your market. If you have a small business and are interested in making sure you're protected, reach out to your local State Farm agent to learn more about what you need. They'll help you find the right policy at the right price for your business. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Talk to your local agent today.
Meanwhile, the 54th Regiment of the 25th Rifle Division, along with the 26th Border Guards Regiment, were defending to the northeast of the city. Their numbers were also dwindling as they whittled down the enemy themselves, so women from the various factories within Odessa were asked to step up, and 2 of them are worth note. One, N.A. Onilova, a worker of the fabric factory, stepped forward and was given a machine gun. After loading up with supplies, she headed to the front. Unfortunately, that didn't take very long, as the front was coming ever closer to Odessa. Then she and those around her were attacked. As the enemy's confidence was growing, a large group of them rushed her position together and out in the open. Onilova lifted her machine gun and let loose. Within seconds, 40 of the enemy were on the ground. In fact, by the time the Siege of Odessa was over, Onilova could claim at least 350 deaths. Another fabric worker, El Polivchenko, took a different route by taking up a sniper's rifle. She had graduated college before the war, so was accepted by the army. Focusing on her fear and anger, by the time the Siege of Odessa was over, she could claim at least 100 deaths, and many of those were officers. The most intense fighting had been going on for 2 weeks now. Best estimates the Soviets had of the Romanians at this point was that the first echelon of their divisions had suffered 50% casualties. No small feat for the defenders. Of course, their own situation was that they had a regiment facing 2 Romanian divisions each because they had suffered 40% casualties. Simply, there was nothing for it but a pullback, which took place during the night of August 19th. That would make the defensive perimeter shorter, and that would allow more bodies per foot along the defensive line. As things now stood, the defenders could see more of the city they were defending when they turned around than previously. Hindsight allows us to proclaim that the first phase of defending Odessa had come to a close on August 19th, which had started on August 5th. Now Romania brought in more fresh troops. Odessa and Moscow reacted to this by, once again, reorganizing their command and control. As just covered, the Southern Front had been forced to pull back to the eastern side of the Dnieper River. Having said that, there was still a ways away, relatively speaking, in terms of communication, i.e., a streamlined system where HQ could hear of a fresh attack and send out orders in quick reaction that would actually be followed. And that's what the Stavka and HQ of Odessa got busy doing. Back on August 16th, as the fighting was heavy that day as well, the CNC of the southwestern direction, Marshal of the Soviet Union, S.M. Bunyany, sent a request to the Stavka to have the coastal army subordinate itself to the military council of the Black Sea Fleet, but with an experienced operational ground commander to liaise with the naval body. Just 3 days later, August 19th, seeing the sense of this, the Stavka ordered that the Odessa Defensive District be established. The military council of the Black Sea Fleet was in command over the coastal army, the Odessa naval base, and some of the ships of the Black Sea Fleet. Lieutenant General G.P. Safronov got a new boss, but he didn't mind. The entire Odessa area was now under a unified command. Everyone knew who was above and below them. Communications were simplified and shortened. All through this, everyone stayed busy. At the end of this order from the Stavka, outlining the new command structure, came a priority. The Odessa Defense District was told to hold out as long as possible. Meanwhile, the civilians inside the city were to continue making all the fortifications possible and help put them in place. And what never stopped was some organ of the government looking for volunteers for the Black Sea Fleet or the Coastal Army. Moscow wisely used the plight of the Odessa defenders to inspire the regular army, and vice versa. Back to the fighting, Romania was bringing in massive reinforcements. By August 20th, there were 17 divisions and 7 brigades now around Odessa, while those defending the port city numbered some 34,500, with 660 submachine guns, 418 heavy and 703 light machine guns, 303 artillery pieces, and a grand total of 2 tanks. Overhead were 19 aircraft, but all these were defending some 80 kilometers of territory. Basically, the math wasn't mathing, but the heart rarely follows logic. There were two main reasons for this massive reinforcement to be followed by an expected victory. First, people like Hitler, or Chief of the OKH, so Supreme Commander of the German Army General Holder, and General Keitel, Chief of Staff of the OKW, the Supreme High Command of the Armed Forces, were starting to write nasty entries into their diaries and to write nasty letters, and those were sent to Bucharest. Hitler was worried about the Romanian oil. His generals worried about a continuous front and their desire to take Crimea, and Prime Minister Antonescu with getting a hold of all that promised territory, namely from his country's border to Odessa, and that city was to be the center of this newly acquired territory. But no area capital, no giving of land. So the Romanians were fighting for the Germans, but also for themselves. Meanwhile, Antonescu told the officers around him that it was embarrassing to have troops with weak morale and low combat effectiveness. Of course, he could have asked himself what they were getting out of this besides, a solid chance to die. Not much is the answer. So instead of what he should have been saying to his men, he issued the following order. Dismiss those formation commanders as well as those commanders of regiments, battalions, and companies, the units of which are not attacking with complete resolve. Turn them over for trial and deprive them of the right to a pension. Deprive those soldiers who fail to go on the attack with the proper élan and who abandon a defensive line of their property and government assistance for the rest of the war. Execute on the spot those soldiers who lose their weapon. If a formation retreats without justification, the chief is obliged to deploy machine guns in their rear and to shoot the fleers piteously. Not exactly stirring stuff. Still, generals were removed, officers and soldiers were shot. And now that the men and various staffs had their motivation rejuvenated for them, they got to work. On August 20th, the latest and greatest offensive got started. To the northeast of Odessa, 3 Soviet rifle divisions and auxiliaries took on 12 infantry and 1 tank and 2 cavalry divisions. Meanwhile, to the west of Odessa, 7 Romanian divisions were moving closer through no man's land. Whenever the Romanians pierced a line, they focused on finding the end of that particular line to attack its flanks. This worked more than it didn't. Before the day was over, some sections of the outer perimeter had fallen back, while others had not. For the Soviets, continuity had been lost. Moreover, the Soviet Black Sea Fleet was being bombed numerous times a day, and the Soviet Air Force found itself under constant attack. So few planes could help the ground troops, and the artillery crews were fighting enemy artillery crews just to stay alive, never mind covering the infantry. And this went on for 5 days. Soon Odessa itself was bombarded daily. Ships were being lost, as were port facilities. Still, defenders would only stop fighting if they found themselves dead. Otherwise, resistance was the order of the day. Another thing that did not change was the results of all this fighting. Yes, the Romanians were coming in hard from the north, northwest, west, and southwest, but they were losing men and materiel, just as they had before. The Romanian units to the north of Odessa were bloodied. To the west, the Romanian 3rd Infantry Division was literally wiped out, obliterated. To the southwest of the city, 2 Romanian divisions suffered the same fate. And during all this, the Romanian command simply continued to feed in more fresh troops. So it will come as no surprise that most, if not all, defensive sections were pushed back between 4 to 15 kilometers. To the south of Odessa, it was the worst. Yet this loss of territory was matched in the north. Yes, the fighting lines here were uneven and made little sense, But just north of the outskirts of Odessa, the Romanians were getting closer. The only thing that stopped this advance was the committing of the last of the 95th Rifle Division's reserves. And in a sign of the changing times, Odessa headquarters launched counterattacks to the south and west on August 21st. But they not only failed, few of those men returned. With things looking bleak for the Russians of Odessa, it's past time for some political comedy. Late on August 21st, Prime Minister Antonescu arrived at a newly taken section just north of Odessa because, one, he wanted to be there to lead the troops personally when Odessa finally fell, and two, and this is important, August 23rd was his birthday. He wanted Odessa given to him as a gift by his men. That day, he said as troops were marching past saluting, "Soldiers, make the final effort to end the struggle. Attack! Over the next 2 days, you will take possession of the most important port on the Black Sea. The entire world is watching you in order to see you in Odessa." Not that the Russians were giving up. On August 22nd, 600 sailors from Sevastopol volunteered to join the fight. The idea was for them to counterattack at a single point, to push the enemy back. This attack was launched in the early morning hours of August 23rd, the Prime Minister's birthday. The plan was, as the Soviet 161st Rifle Regiment was barely hanging on, the sailors would hit the enemy just to the side of where the 161st was. Sure enough, between surprise and their numbers, the counterattack pushed the enemy back to the point where the Romanian trenches were come upon. The sailors jumped down and hand-to-hand combat ensued. The Romanians broke and ran. Once a small town nearby was recaptured by these sailors, they were told to stop advancing. No point in getting them cut off and annihilated. For the next 48 hours, these sailors simply went around and destroyed everything that was Romanian, from people to vehicles to supplies that could not be carried back. On their third night, they were told to come home. However, to do so through the enemy line that was opposite the beleaguered 161st Rifle Regiment. The men from Sevastopol did, the enemy force was wiped out, and the sailors were greeted by the riflemen and with medals. Not that this moment changed the larger conflict. The Romanians, with more German infantry than before, were still closer to the city than before. And though the men of the 1st Naval Regiment, again, who had given stellar service thus far, came under heavy attack, as it was close to the coast, again, just above Odessa, their naval comrades brought to bear against the enemy their large guns. The naval regiment was saved, and now it was the Germans, along with the Romanians, that got to experience naval firepower, up close and personal. And yet, clocks keep ticking, and time goes by. By the end of August, there were telltale signs of Odessa's fate. First, the defending bombers and fighters, never many, operating over Odessa, were being given different assignments, as the fighting to the north and northeast of Odessa was not faring well. Secondly, the Odessa military district and the Stavka were able to now send in fewer men to fill the ranks of those lost. Simply, there were other, higher priorities elsewhere. By August 30th, only 25,000 men and women were still strong enough to report for duty. But even if a huge influx of men somehow appeared in Odessa, there was a good chance they would not have a weapon, as weapons and ammunition were starting to run low. The critical area now was to the north of Odessa. On August 24th, the defensive line was once again pushed back closer to the city's outskirts. The Odessa Defense District's command told all in this area to pull back to the Bolshoi-Azalinsky estuary, or the small estuary as it is called today, the one just north of Odessa. To the north, the enemy was gaining momentum, but in other areas, the Romanians were only 8 to 12 kilometers away from Odessa's edge. Going back to the north, the men of the 412th Coastal Battery, which had been covering the brave 1st Regiment of Naval Infantry, were now in an untenable position. The enemy was advancing with little time to spare, so the gunners, despite their desire, destroyed their own guns, took up their rifles, and joined the naval regiment. Whatever happened here would happen to all of them. But it was August 25th that was the black day for Odessa. Not only did German and Romanian artillery fire on the city and its port facilities, they were now close enough to fire on individual ships entering or leaving the harbor. Now, no one was safe. No supplies were safe. But also on the 25th, 9 infantry divisions, with tanks leading the way, came at Odessa. It was to be all-out war. I guess Prime Minister Antonescu was upset about not getting his birthday gift. Greetings, everyone, from Central Virginia. So just a couple of people to thank, even though I most heartily thank you. Let's see here. My latest member is Timothy Waddell from Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Thank you very much, Timothy. Let's see here. As far as donations, James Skinner made a donation. Thank you very much, James. And I believe I've seen your name before. You've donated before. So again, thank you very much. And Mago Sosa, a gentleman I think I mentioned last time, bought a Churchill mug. And Sosa, it is on the way to you now. I will send you the tracking information. And I got a very nice email from a Peter Greco. He's emailed me before, and he's enjoying the series, and he's caught up now, and he's wondering what to do. I don't know what to tell you, buddy, but I'll get these out as fast as I can. Anyway, so as you can tell, we're kind of, the back of the Odessa defenders has been broken, and what's next is inevitable. Take care, everyone.
Thanks to State Farm for supporting this show and helping our listeners protect their businesses and lives. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Talk to your local agent today.